afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us. Just before we begin, the session will be recorded, and everyone is in listen-only mode, but if you have any questions, feel free to add them to the questions pane, and we'll answer them as we get a chance to. I'm Hella Schwartz-Grossman. I'm the marketing manager at Worldox, and I'm very excited to introduce our guest today, Kip Boyle, who's going to join us for a conversation about cybersecurity as a competitive advantage. Kip is a 20-year information security expert and founder at a virtual chief information security officer of Cyber Risk Opportunities. He has served as the chief information security officer for both technology and financial services companies, and was a cybersecurity consultant at Stanford Research Institute. Often quoted in Forbes, entrepreneur and chief executive, Kip has also taught information security to hundreds of students all over the world, in addition to co-authoring Chapter 68, Outsourcing Security Functions, in the Computer Security Handbook. The conversation today is about secure data practices are a competitive differentiator for all companies, and especially for law and professional services firms. If you're an attorney, you have a professional responsibility to protect client data, and treating cybercrime as a business risk is the very best approach, considering the nature and frequency of cyber attacks now and for the foreseeable future. So, Kip, we have, why are secure data practices a competitive differentiator? We'll start with that.
Sure. Thank you for asking. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. Hello, everybody. I have to first apologize for my video. I'm not sure what happened, and all I can say is my computer must have some kind of a critical need detector. And when I needed my video to work, it decided, nope, sorry, that is not going to happen today. So my apologies for that. But I am very glad to be here, and I hope that as we go through this conversation today, that I want to echo what Hella said, which is if you have questions that you'd like to ask, please put them, tell us what your questions are, because I really want to hear from you. I really want to know what's going on in your world. But to your question, Hella, why are secure data practices a competitive differentiator? Well, in order to answer that question, the first thing I've got to do is make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to a particular assumption that's really crucial that I always check with people on. And the assumption is this, is that cyber risk today is in fact an existential risk for everybody. And what I mean by that is that in the past, people who have been doing business for maybe you've been in business for 10, 15, 20 years now, and perhaps you remember a time when you could use a computer without ever having a password. You didn't have to have a password. You could just walk up to a computer, shake the mouse, or tap the keyboard. It would sort of, be available to you. And then over time, we asked people to start using passwords, and then the passwords got more complicated. And now we're to a point where we're asking people to turn on multi-factor authentication and enter a code when you try to get to a bank account or something like that online. What this is reflecting is the fact that cyber as a risk has been changing. It's been getting more and more difficult. And so when I call it an existential risk, what I'm really saying is that it's very serious now. Every organization that's on the internet has to recognize that the nature of cyber risk has changed. It's become so much more serious. And I actually believe that the seriousness of cyber is on par, or maybe even bigger, than risk to sales, order fulfillment, and accounts receivable, right? So if you think about it, if you can't get new clients to hire you, or if you can't get them what you promised to and get that to them on time, or if you can't collect the money that they owe you, a failure in any one of those areas is going to put you out of business ultimately. Now those are very serious risks, and they can cost you your livelihood. Typically, those risks play out over time. It usually takes weeks or months for a serious failure in one of those areas to actually, push you out of business or make you realize that you probably should close your doors. But cyber can put you out of business overnight. It can actually, you can go to bed feeling like you're on top of the world and everything is going the way you want it to. And then you wake up the next morning and you get a call from somebody on your team that says, there's a goofy message on all of our computers and nobody can get anything done. And something about Bitcoin. What is this? And I've had plenty of people call me downstream from having that very thing happen to them. And so, boy, no one today can do business without their computers, and they certainly can't do business without connecting their computers to the internet. So, yeah, I think any risk that can put you out of business potentially within just a few hours is material and is in fact existential in its nature. So, Rebecca, what do you think?
I agree. I think one of the things that strikes me, actually, I think while we're talking, maybe Hella, can you put up the first polling question? And we'll talk while we're waiting for some answers to that.
Great
But
idea.
ultimately, I think that like what you were talking about first there were no passwords, and then you started to have a password to things, and now you have to have multi-factor authentication. The thing that I'm seeing is that even though people are starting to get more used to those things, they are still they still see it as a pain. Like, oh, why do I have to, oh no, I have to enter this two-factor information.
Right.
They haven't gotten past that, this is, for me, I accept that, and in fact, I turn multi-factor authentication on for any account that has that option, because I know that that's the best way to protect my account. And I think that we're sort of at a turning point right now where people are finally, because so many of these things are hitting the news and so many things are happening to people personally, that they're starting to recognize, hopefully, that yes, this is a pain because you have to enter additional information, but it's a necessary it's necessary in order to protect all of that personal information.
Yeah, yeah. And I see the results of the quick poll. 90% of our audience members have in fact received a phishing email trying to steal their user ID and password. So, and really the point of this polling question is to just point out to you that you are a target. And it really doesn't matter what kind of business you're in. It doesn't matter how large or how small your firm might be. It doesn't matter what industry you operate in. We've got customers at Cyber Risk Opportunities who grow fruit, okay? I mean, we
Well,
have apple growers, right? And they look at me and they're like, we're just farmers. What's going on here? You know, and I have to explain to them exactly what we're talking about right now, which is, yes, I understand you sell fruit, but you're actually a technology company that happens to sell fruit. And you really need to turn the corner on the way you think about it.
well, and I think these days everybody, to your point, even fruit farmers, everybody is using technology to support their businesses these days, and
Right.
it became even more so during the pandemic when nobody was going to any brick and mortar, situation.
Hmm.
But I think another thing that you pointed out is so many people think because oh, I'm just a sole practitioner, or oh, we only have a small firm, who's going to target us? And
Hmm.
what I think people don't realize is that while there are certain situations where people are targeting a very specific company with very specific information, so many of the people who are so many of the perpetrators of these things are doing, they're just sending things out, because if they send out a million of these phishing emails to just random collections of email addresses, even if like 5% of the people click on something,
Hmm.
then that's what they're doing. That's how they're getting you, is that
Yeah.
5% is going to be in trouble. So, I mean, they're not specifically targeting your small business, but just because you're a small business doesn't mean you're not going to be
That,
targeted.
That's right. And I think what a lot of people don't understand, and I don't blame them for not understanding this, okay? Because first of all, the news, the mainstream media is doing an awful job of reporting on this. Secondly, Hollywood's not doing us any favors because they continue to portray cybersecurity in an old, using very old and not realistic tropes anymore, right? 1983, War Games, the movie comes out with starring Matthew Broderick. Go watch that movie, by the way, because oh my gosh, has he ever looked more young? So, but what was that movie about? It was largely about a socially maladjusted kid with disengaged parents who screwed around on the computer a lot and almost started World War III. Well, okay, fine. Maybe in 1983 that was the big problem, but now you've got shows that were produced more recently, like Mr. Robot, which stars Rami Malek. And what's going on? Oh, he's a socially maladjusted, person, actually mentally ill person who who single-handedly, or with a small crew, destroys, the economy of the United States. Okay, thank you, Hollywood. Like we that's not what's going on anymore. What's going on is that you've got well-funded organizations based in geographic parts of the world that have no extradition treaty with the United States. In other words, that they're lawless in terms of our ability to stop them from doing anything. They work in office buildings. They have well lit working spaces. They have um, payrolls and benefits, and they have practically employee manuals. And you can see when you look at the attacks, like when we monitor the attacks on the internet, you can see the attacks rise as working hours begin in the Eastern European areas. You can see the attacks fall off during lunch, and you can kind of see them resume again after lunchtime is over with, and then when they finally go home for the day. So the threat is very different than what you think it is. And I encourage people to see the threat more as a competitor, right? A competitor who comes to your town, opens up a shop and sells what you sell, except their stuff is twice as good and 30% less. How would you respond to that? Because that's how you need to respond to the people on the internet today who are attacking us.
Yep.
They're more
I
of a
think,
competitor. They're more of a competitor.
yeah. You know, what you're saying, I've seen things change so much since like the first time I ever heard of ransomware to now, where like, at the very beginning, I don't think they did have office bill, although there
No,
were, other countries definitely had people in office buildings who were doing that sort of thing, but there were also a lot of little independent people who were doing it. And
sure.
you're right that now, I mean, now they even back then you'd get this thing about paying a ransom in Bitcoin. And if you didn't know what that was, then you were going to have to spend money to get people to come in and help you. Now they have help desks that
That's
you
right.
can call and they will help you because they want to get their money.
That's right. The people ripping
So,
you off have better customer service than your cable provider.
yeah, yes.
They do.
It's amazing, right? It's absolutely stunning. And so, what started all this, right? Well, Hella said, why are secure data practices a competitive differentiator? So I hope we can all agree on this assumption, which is that cyber is an existential risk. It's no longer just this sort of annoying thing that sometimes happens to us where we can't use our computer for a couple of hours, or our website, gets a little messed up, and so we've got to call somebody to get them fixed, to fix that. It's now much bigger problem than that. Okay, so now I want to tell you a quick story about a law firm, and I want just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. Okay, and this happened a while ago. This happened actually in 2012, right? So 9 years ago. But there was a law firm called Puckett and Farage, and they were four lawyers in practice together with two offices. They had one in Alexandria, Virginia. They had one in San Diego, California. And by the way, you can look at this up on the internet and just do a quick Google search, and you can get all the details here. But what happened was is that they specialized in the defense of military members who were accused of wrongdoing. And so they were actually defending some U.S. Marines who had been accused of participating in an illegal killing in 2005. Well, so somebody on the internet decided that Marines accused of war crimes didn't deserve to be defended. And so the law firm was attacked, and 3 gigabytes of private email messages were taken from the law firm and were released on the open internet. And so, and we even have in that email database that was released, you can even see in there members of the firm talking to each other about the fact that they're under attack, and talking about the fact that if they don't figure out a way to stop this, that it could completely destroy the law firm. You can actually read this stuff, okay? So and Marcy Atwood was the firm's business manager, and she talks a lot about this. She even sent emails to her mother saying, "Oh my gosh, Mom, what are we going to do? We're trying to get Google on the phone, blah blah blah," and it's just awful. And so, what did they lose? Detailed records, transcripts, testimony, trial evidence, legal defense donation records, right? Because these Marines were being defended at no cost to them. Anyway, the short sort of story here is that the firm did dissolve because they lost their reputation. Nobody would turn to them for their ability to represent them. It wasn't about money. It really wasn't about anything beyond really reputation. And I think people have to understand that that's what we're really talking about here. When I say it's an existential risk, what I'm really saying is that your reputation, which is really at the end of the day all anybody really has, is at risk. Rebecca,
Yep.
you were nodding your head like you'd heard that story before.
Yeah, and just basically all of the stories of every law firm that's had any sort of very, very public situation like that. Actually, well, I don't know. The one that always comes to my mind is Mossack Fonseca,
Sure.
the Panama Papers one, which, by the way, if you don't know, they made a movie about that, which if you haven't seen, it's actually quite good. I
Oh,
think
I want to see
Antonio
it.
Banderas is in it, and it's just very good. Um, but because it gives a lot of the backstory that we saw the headlines, but there was a whole backstory to it that unless you were really looking at all the details, you might not have heard. But just in general, that's the thing that law firms, I think, need to understand the most, is that it really is about their reputation. And I mean, the ABA has had, occasionally they come out with some new guidance about things, but it wasn't until I found it a little ironic that a year into the pandemic, they came out with some guidance about the virtual practice of law. So I think, it took them a long time to gather the information, but the information that they finally put out was actually really helpful. But one of the things about them that always strikes me as funny is they throw around the word reasonable.
Yes.
And so what does it actually mean to put reasonable efforts in place when you're trying to protect yourself, from cybersecurity risks? And I always felt that they used that word in part so that what they were saying could apply to firms of all sizes.
Yeah.
But it still leaves a lot to the imagination. So what do you think that they mean when they say reasonable cybersecurity?
Yeah. First of all, I want to acknowledge that when you say somebody, well, you should be reasonable. Well, that's about as vague as you can get without saying
Yeah.
nothing. So I understand that's very frustrating, especially when you're telling somebody be reasonable about something they've never been trained in, don't really fully understand, right? Never get paid to understand and that sort of thing, right? So I mean, it's really annoying to hear that, but I have an answer for you. Here's the answer. So it actually comes from the Federal Trade Commission. So they talk about reasonable cybersecurity, and they actually give a little more texture to this. Let me tell you what they say. They say that you have to have reasonable security measures for an entity of a similar size and sophistication. That's one dimension, right? So in other words, they're not going to compare a law firm to a pizza parlor, right? They're not going to compare a small law firm to a giant law firm, right? So if you're a white shoe law firm in the Northeast, they're not going to compare that to, you've got a 4-attorney practice, in California. So that's one thing, similar size and sophistication. And then the second dimension is given the type, amount, and methods of data collected. So again, you're not going to be compared as a law firm. Let's say you don't accept credit cards for payment of fees. Well, so then you're not going to be compared to a corner store, even though they are of a similar size and sophistication. Let's say they were, or whatever. Think of someone who's of a similar size and sophistication, but they collect credit cards for payment. You don't. Well, you're not going to be compared to them because the type, amount, and methods of data that you're collecting is different. But what you are going to be compared to is other law firms of your size and of your sophistication. Now the FTC is talking about organizations in general, right? They've released that guidance for all kinds of types of businesses. But when it comes to the practice of law, we have to overlay what the FTC says with what the legal profession says, right? So we've got rules of professional conduct. By the way, I'm not a lawyer. I've never been a lawyer, and I'm not a lawyer now, but I hang out with a lawyer a lot. So if you ever listen to our podcast, the Cyber Risk Management Podcast, my co-host is Jake Bernstein. He is a lawyer. He's actually licensed to practice law, and he also knows a lot about cybersecurity and privacy. So what I know, I've kind of learned from him, and then also doing my own self-study. But you have rules of professional conduct, right? And here in Washington State, where I live, there's RPC 1.1, which talks about maintaining competence as to the benefits and risks of technology. And then there's another one, and this is RPC 1.6 subpart C, where it says that a lawyer shall make reasonable efforts to prevent the inadvertent or unauthorized disclosure of unauthorized access to information relating to the representation of a client. So it's putting some more specificity on it, right? It's still not telling you exactly what you need to do, but there's a reason for that, and I want people to understand why. Cyber is not a static risk, okay? Human beings are kind of used to dealing with static risks. And I'll give you an example of fire. Fire is a static risk. Fire is always made up of heat, fuel, and oxygen. If you remove one of those key ingredients, the fire will go out. If you can't bring all three of those ingredients together, the fire will not start. And now that we know that that using flame-resistant materials in the construction of buildings, the installation of water sprinklers, making sure that there's a fire hydrant close by and that there's a well-funded fire department, right? We're not really bothered by fires anymore in big cities, right? You get an occasional one that kind of comes up, but no big cities are burning down anymore like in the late 1800s when Chicago burnt down and San Francisco burnt down and Seattle burnt down. Like, we've dealt with that, right? So fire is not really an issue anymore. Cyber is nothing like that. Cyber is a dynamic risk. It's always changing. So what's reasonable, remember we started this off when I said in the beginning, you could use a computer without a password. Then you needed a password. Then you needed a more complicated password. Now you need multi-factor authentication. So that's why they can only say that it needs to be reasonable, because it's always changing. And that means you're going to need some help to figure out what is reasonable. Maybe there's a peer group that you can join, right, with other attorneys or whatever line of business you happen to be in, where you can all sort of keep up with this together. There's many ways that you can deal with it, but the issue here is you have to be reasonable, and reasonable changes all the time.
And on top of that, I mean, ultimately, depending on the type of law practiced, law firms often store quite a bit of their clients' information. So it's not only about their work product, it's about their work product and the client's data that they're storing for, yes, whether it's discovery purposes or, maybe they have a family law or trust and estates practice and they're storing, the personal information about their clients for those purposes. But this might be a good time actually for the next polling question, I think.
Yeah, I'll put that one up. Give everybody a chance to take a look at it.
So while we wait for the results of the poll, and I hope everybody will participate, you're absolutely right, Rebecca, that law firms are like little treasure chests of highly sensitive information. And a few years ago, there were some law firms in the Northeast United States that were doing a lot of business related to the future release of earnings from publicly traded companies. And guess what? They were they were broken into so that insider trading could be done by the people who had broken in, and they were getting advance warnings of earnings estimates, and so that's an example where they're able to turn money into cash almost immediately because that information was so market sensitive. Um, so I just wanted to, point out that it's not just about knowing, people's secrets, right? Like maybe some trade secrets or something like that. But sometimes it's just flat out, like, I need this because I need to make a killing, with a stock trade.
Mm-hmm. That happened to some firms on the East Coast too. So.
Yep, it did.
Yeah.
Big ones.
Here's the result of the poll.
Okay. 100% no. Well, that's really interesting. Let me tell you why I think that's super interesting, because in my line of work, so I work as a virtual chief information security officer. And what that really means is, if you've ever heard of something called like a fractional chief financial officer, like a fractional CFO or something like that, what that means is that I generally am helping organizations who are big enough to have these problems that we're talking about, but they're not big enough to be able to afford to have somebody like me on their team on a full-time basis, right? So they can sort of rent me as needed, and I can provide some leadership to help them make a strategy and make some good decisions. The number one source of referrals to my business is attorneys. So that's how most people come to know me. And so here's the thing that I want to say about that polling question. If your clients are not coming to you today asking you about cybersecurity, that's great. My bet is that they will start to, as more and more problems arise, as the pressure gets higher and higher and higher on all of us. And that kind of brings us to another thing that I wanted to talk about, which was like, how much worse can this problem get, right? And actually the data is pretty clear. So it was, I think in 2015, the global cost of cybercrime and cyber failures was about $500 billion, right? Billion dollars. This year, 2021, it's estimated to be $6 trillion, right? So think about what that looks like on a graph, right? It looks like a curve going up fast. And the estimation is that in 2025, so just 4 years from now, $10 trillion of global cost. Now, if you aggregated all of that and you compared it to the gross domestic product of countries around the world, this would be the third largest economy in the world, the cyber crime and cyber failure economy. And so hold that in your mind as I explain something else too, which is the United States, and really I would probably say it's reasonable to guess most countries on planet Earth, has no systemic means of deterring cybercrime and has no systemic means of holding cyber criminals responsible for what they do. The statistic is only 3 out of 1,000 cyber criminals are ever arrested. And I'm not talking about convicted. I'm not talking about, penalized or anything like that. Just 3 out of 1,000 are arrested. And so the deterrent factor here for getting into cybercrime is almost zero. And the chance of you getting caught, almost zero. The chance of you being held accountable for anything you do, almost zero. So given that we have no way to deter it, we have virtually no way to hold people accountable, I think it's going to get a lot more. I think it's going to get a lot worse. Rebecca, what does it look like from your point of view?
I agree. I mean, even if you just look at what has happened thus far, I mentioned it already, the early ransomware, you were kind of out of luck if you didn't have somebody to help you figure out how to deal with a Bitcoin ransom, whereas now they've got help desks to help you with these things. So, I mean, just in the amount that it has progressed since ransomware first came out, I don't know. I can't remember. I think I was listening to a presentation by somebody who worked in the banking industry, and they compared the cyber landscape to the early days of airplane flight, in that, at the very beginning of airplane flight, they had all of these different, everybody thought this was so cool. The Wright brothers, they take their first flight, and people are trying to figure out how to use this new technology. And then along comes World War I, and they start using it, in
military.
war. Yeah. And things escalated from there. And I think, in terms of the early days of flight, there wasn't any regulation, there wasn't any of that, and look where we've come since then. Whereas with cybersecurity, we're only now just starting to get regulations put in place. But again, with any type of thing that's regulated, the criminals don't care about the regulations.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens over the next 5 to 10 years.
Oh, absolutely. I think what's going on right now qualifies as a paradigm shift. Now, that little turn of phrase is kind of trite and tired because we've kind of overused it, but I do believe that this does really meet the clinical definition of a paradigm shift, because we've got not just cyber criminals out there with ransomware, but we also have cyber soldiers out there, and they're conducting espionage and doing all kinds of other things. And one of the reasons why the cyber criminals are so good at what they do is because they often are enjoying the protection and the support and encouragement of the intelligence services of the countries in which they're based. So there's a collaboration that's actually going on here, right? And so you really have to step back and realize that this is a paradigm shift because it's changing the very way that nations interact with each other. And so when I started thinking like, well, when's the last time like international relations was had a paradigm shift? And there's been many, but a big one that I think is useful for comparison is the operationalization, if I can get that word out, of nuclear weapons. And it changed the nature of warfare, and it changed the nature of how nations interact with each other, right? Like, what were the new boundaries? Like, how far could I taunt you before you lob a nuke at me, right? Nobody knew. What are the rules of war? Like, when do you use a nuke? Can you use an ICBM? Can you first strike? Is it okay to retaliate? What about a tactical nuke? How, can I lob a nuke 100 miles away, with a small kiloton yield? Like, is that okay? Nobody knew. And we were like biting our nails for decades trying to figure out how do we sort this out, right? Game theory and so forth. And I think we're in a similar situation because we don't know the answers to those questions either. Like, take the attack on Sony Pictures, right? Back in, a few years ago in the early 2010s. Was that an act of war? Right? There was a lot of conversation about that. If you look at the amount of destruction that rained down on Sony Pictures at the time, if that had been a bomb released from the undercarriage of an airplane, well, that surely would have been an act of war. But didn't they create a commensurate amount of damage? I mean, this is really interesting, and we don't have any good answers for that. But Rebecca, if I remember correctly, you had some kind of ringside seat for that, didn't you?
Yeah, the law firm I worked for at the time represented Sony, so I'm not at liberty to share any details, but we did at the time, we were in a position to assist them a little bit with some of the aftermath of that. And it was definitely interesting. But when you're talking about a lot of that, I mean, so that's an interesting case. I think for the most part, there's actually been a certain amount of engagement. I don't think that the general person on the street thinks about this quite as much as those of us who are a little bit more in tune to what's going on in cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm.
But the way I look at it, we are at war. We are at war now.
Mm-hmm.
People just don't necessarily think about it in that same way, because it doesn't affect you in the same way. I mean, it hasn't been. I mean, I think especially with, IoT devices that are now, there are now medical devices that are IoT device. I mean, there's so many the landscape has changed so much, but just in general, our government understands, I think, that we are at war, and there's been a number of things that have like when we think about, well, I don't even want to. I definitely don't want to steer this towards politics, but I mean, just some of the things that have happened. I mean, you mentioned the Sony thing, and there was a whole North Korea situation. What has happened with Iran and their nuclear program, and the cybersecurity situations that have been a backdrop to some of that, and have thwarted some of their development. I mean, these things have already been going on for a long time at this point.
Yeah, definitely. My gosh, there's so much to unpack there, right? But what I want to really touch on, right, is this idea that we are in a state of war, and we are, and this is awfully difficult to think about because it's all very abstract, right? We really don't see it happening in front of our eyes per se. But if you think about the fact that an intercontinental ballistic missile, right, just to sort of do some comparison here, it takes about 30 minutes from the time you launch one on the other side of the globe until it hits a target on the other side of the world. So we have early warning systems that will tell us, right, when a missile actually is launched. It creates a rather large heat signature, and we have satellites orbiting the Earth that'll tell us that. What good is it? I don't know. I mean, this starts getting to the weird stuff, but the point is that you can detect it, right? And so you do have an opportunity to at least think about, what am I going to do? But the time to send a cyber attack from that same point on the other side of the planet is milliseconds. Milliseconds. And every computer connected to the internet is, in fact, on a digital battlefield, just as much as it's in a digital commercial space, right? So it's a city center because we're doing commerce and we're selling things and trading things, but it's also a battlefield because it's completely available. It's a new domain of fighting, as well as a new domain of politics and a new domain of commerce. But we don't really see that. It's a lot of it is going on behind the scenes.
Well, some of the things that have been reported more recently, like some of the more things relating to critical infrastructure and the solar winds. I mean, that they're again, your point when you talked about the Sony thing. I mean, that's not like one government attacking another government. That's a government that maybe was involved in an attack on a commercial enterprise. So different and hard to know, again, what those rules are that you were talking about. But with the solar winds thing, I mean, that is something that affected so many companies everywhere, including government entities.
Yeah, up to 1,500.
Yeah. So I think we're just starting to see some of those more critical infrastructure attacks starting to happen more and more, and that's what worries me.
Well, and let me give you some very specific examples from very recent times, and these did make it into the headlines, and so I'm glad they did. But JBS, right, was and is a meat packing organization. They got attacked, and that disrupted the supply of food to restaurants and to grocery stores. We've also got the cyber attack on Colonial Pipeline, which actually resulted in panic gasoline buying, which resulted in gas stations in the eastern United States having no gas. Right? People like, where am I going to get gas from? And so this stuff is actually starting to seep into the world of typical people who don't know anything about cyber security, right? But it's starting to creep into everyday life, and I think that we're going to see more and more and more of that as we move into the future. There was another example I want to give is in the west coast of Florida. The name of the city is escaping me, but there was a drinking water
treatment plant. Yeah.
Yes. And somebody had broken in and had fiddled with the amount of lye that was being released into the water. So lye is a caustic chemical that in the right proportions will sanitize water, but in too high of proportions will actually hurt and kill people if they ingest it. So, so again, we're starting to see, drinking water. Drinking water? Come on, really? Electrons flying around the world unseen can actually change the safety of drinking water. How about death? How about human death? So there was a year ago in Germany, there was an ambulance en route to the University Hospital at Dusseldorf who unfortunately happened to be under a ransomware attack, and they turned the ambulance away and sent them to another emergency room, and the patient died en route. Can you say that that ransomware was the cause of death? Well, prosecutors in Germany are actually filing charges against, anonymous attackers to find out, right? Was that actually you know, um, was that ransomware attack actually a cause of death? Now that was
Yeah.
last year. This year we've had another situation where it was an American hospital. There was a child born. It was in distress, and the typical monitoring equipment that the nurse teams use in the neonatal intensive care unit, those monitors were offline. And when the child went into exceptional distress, they didn't see that, and the baby died. So there's now a lawsuit to determine whether ransomware was what the cause or contributing factor or whatever. Now, what's the point of all this conversation, Rebecca? It's to make the case that cyber is an existential risk, and that if you are a very good cyber risk manager, you can create a competitive advantage for yourself in the market, just like people who manage their sales really well, people who manage their order fulfillment really well, and the risks to accounts receivable. When you are very, very good at taking risks in those areas, you can outperform your competitors. And my assertion is that you can now if you do a great job of managing cyber risk, you will do a great job of surviving the kinds of attacks that we're going to see more and more of. And I want to give you a real life example, and it happened in 2017. There was a crypto worm. It was called NotPetya. And it was called a crypto worm because this is a little piece of code that went from computer to computer and encrypted the hard drive. Now, there was never an opportunity to purchase a key to get it unencrypted because this wasn't a ransomware. This was just a plain old, I'm going to encrypt your data so that you can't have it again type of an attack. And that worm ran amok, and it did about $10 billion of damage, and it affected a lot of organizations like Maersk, the shipping company, Merck, the pharmaceutical companies, and I want to tell you a story about two particular companies in Europe, Tnt Express and DHL. So these are small package companies, right? They pick up and deliver small packages. Now, they both got hit. Now, Tnt Express is actually owned by FedEx. They had recently acquired them in a transaction. So both of these companies got hit. Now, Tnt Express fell down on its face. When they got hit by NotPetya, every computer got locked up. They couldn't pick up packages. They couldn't deliver packages. They didn't even know where any of the packages in their possession were actually at. They didn't know if they were in a truck or in a warehouse or anything because their computers were completely unavailable to them. DHL got hit by this, but they didn't lose control of their business. They stayed in business. They could continue to deliver packages, pick them up. They knew where everything was. And if you look at the annual reports of both of these companies following this attack, you see a very, very clear pattern. DHL's volumes in the weeks and months after the attack go up. Their revenues go up. Their profit goes up. TNT, you see the exact opposite. Everything goes down. And in fact, in the earnings calls in the next year following the attack, you actually have the CEO of FedEx on the record as saying that if TNT had not been a wholly owned subsidiary or a subsidiary of FedEx, it would have gone bankrupt because the costs of recovering from that were so enormous that they were out of reach for a company as well capitalized as Tnt Express. So they needed a bailout in order to get back into business. And if you think about it, I mean, DHL, what a massive competitive advantage. Let's say the attack never occurred and DHL said, we want more market share. What would they have had to have done to gain the additional revenue, package volume, and profitability that they did simply by being good enough at cyber risk management that they kept their doors open when their competitor fell on its face? And then this is one example that I want to put out there that we've actually seen where good cyber risk management keeps you in business when it causes your competitors to stumble.
This might be a good time, I think, for our third polling question.
Yes.
Here it goes.
Because risk management leads directly to this next topic of cyber liability insurance.
Yeah, think about this, right? We now have insurance policies, and these have existed for a while, so I'm not trying to suggest that this is the first time we've ever seen them. There have been cyber liability policies for many years now, but more and more people are buying them, and there's actually a tremendous amount of turmoil right now in this market. Most insurance companies move very slowly. Their products change very slowly. It's very difficult to innovate in the insurance space. But cyber insurance is boiling right now like a big pot of water. And when I talk to people in the industry, they can't believe how fast things are changing. Just, I would say about 18 months ago, if my customer came to me and said, hey, would you help me with the insurance renewal here? We have a renewal. Sure, no problem. We'd fill out the paperwork and it was pretty straightforward. And sometimes the paperwork was almost nothing. But in the last 12 months, we're starting to see big changes in cyber insurance where they won't even sell you a cyber insurance policy unless you have multi-factor authentication turned on everywhere. Like they won't even, at any price, they won't sell you a policy without that. And that's because insurance companies know, because they're paying attention, because their money is at risk, because they've lost a lot recently, but they know what we can be doing to actually decrease the risk that we're going to suffer a claim, right? An event that can be claimed as a covered event. And so it's interesting, Rebecca, because I've worked in the insurance industry before, but I did not foresee insurance becoming a national and even global leader on how to protect yourself when you're connected to the internet. I kind of always assumed that, the American government or, or some other government, would sort of take a leadership role and would really sort this out, but that's not what's happening. It's insurance that's sorting this out and telling us how to actually avoid a claim. And actually, this is very reminiscent. Once I started studying it, I went, oh, of course, it was insurance companies that told us how to construct our cities so that they don't burn to the ground all the time. They were the ones that sorted out that you needed to use, fire-resistant materials and so forth. So that's what we can look forward to there.
I was thinking maybe lawyers were somehow involved in the change in the cyber insurance as well.
Oh, those sneaky lawyers, I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, here are the results of the polls. I'll just put them up. There we go.
Okay. 63% does not have a cyber liability insurance policy. Well, you should probably check into it if you haven't. You really should.
Yeah, I think I know you have a lot more to say on this than I do, but I do know that not all cyber policies are made equal.
Oh, no. In fact, it's extremely difficult to compare. You could get a quote from two different carriers and they don't look at all like each other. So for those of us who are used to buying like insurance for our personal automobiles or something like that, we can practically buy on price comparison alone as long as the coverages are identical, right? We have the same amount for body and injury, the same amount for uninsured motorists and so forth. You can practically just buy on price. But that's not what's going on with cyber insurance. It's all over the place. It's completely non-standard. And some people think they have good cyber liability coverage because it's been tacked on to their professional liability insurance or the E&O or something like that, or their general liability. And if that's what you're thinking, you need to go check on it, because I've had customers, give me their policies and I look at it and I go, once you factor in all of the exclusions and all of the deductibles, you have effectively $10,000 of coverage. Do you know that you can't even hire a law firm for as little as $10,000 to help you with something like this? I mean, that won't even pay the trust deposit, I should think. So, and you're not going to get that right away anyway. But one of the reasons why companies are going out of business due to cyber is because the costs of recovery are just out of reach. It's not that they can't be recovered, it's that you cannot pay for it. And so that's a big thing that cyber liability policies will do for you. They'll do a lot more for you too. And I could talk a lot about, if you get the right policy, how it's more than worth its cost and premium. But I'm not here to sell insurance, and I'm not an insurance professional, so I will resist the temptation. But Rebecca, did you want to say anything else about the insurance?
Well, the one thing that I have always heard, I was on a panel a long time ago it was when the comments to rules 1.1 and 1.6 of the ABA model rules first came out. And I was on a panel with a judge, a partner in a law firm, and an insurance guy. And the judge and the partner in the law firm were going to talk about the changes in the ABA model rules. I was going to talk about, from a technology standpoint, what does that mean to you? And the insurance guy was going to throw in the insurance perspective. And one of the points that he made in his talk was that when you answer those questionnaires that the insurance companies give you when you're buying your policy, do you have multi-factor authentication? Do you have, some sort of a policy in place about what people are allowed to do with remote work? Do you have this kind of policy, that kind of policy, password requirements, all these other things? If you say that you have these things in place and you don't, and there's a breach because somebody didn't do what they were supposed to or did not follow that policy or somehow got around something, then you might not actually be covered.
Right.
So when you answer those things, you have to make sure that everybody, especially if it's something that you can't control technologically, like multi-factor authentication, you can typically turn that on across the board. Now, if you've got like a partner in a law firm who says, this is too much of a pain for me, just turn it off for me because I'm the managing partner or something like that. If there's then a breach because that one person had it turned off, then the firm's not covered.
That's right. That's absolutely correct. I mean, everything you've ever heard about insurance companies being very careful about, which claims they pay, and believe me, they understand their exclusions way better than we do, and that's in play here. And it doesn't help that insurance companies who have written a lot of cyber liability policies with either no underwriting requirements or very few and very loose ones are getting claimed to death right now. So it's not just the normal, we don't want to pay a claim sort of a vibe. This is actually, oh my goodness, like our finances are being strained by the amount of claims that we're receiving. And I wouldn't say that it's an existential threat to them yet, but they certainly don't want it to become one. So, and by the way, you didn't mention this, but just to be clear, and I don't know what the likelihood is that anybody would do this, but it is fraudulent to actually fill out an insurance application and lie. So, I mean, you're opened up for that too.
Well, there's that, but there's also like if your company has like a policy about stuff and somebody it could just be because of a mistake that somebody,
Right.
With multi-factor authentication, that's something that you turn it on for everybody and it's on for everybody. But some of the policies that you put out that are kind of on the honor system,
yes,
those sorts of things are more what I would consider to be the bigger problems.
I'm not gonna push back on you, Rebecca, on that. No, but I am gonna note that we're 3 minutes to the top of the hour. And did we get any questions, Hella?
We did not get any questions put in, but Rebecca, maybe you could go to the last slide because we have some links and some information about Kip's the very
this
last
link
one.
Okay.
One more. It will combine all of them.
Yay!
All right.
We have everything there, so we can,
Yeah, so, thanks, Hella. So listen, for those of you who tuned in today, I want to share a copy of my book with you. So I've got a free PDF version of my book, and I'll just, we'll go ahead and email you the link to that as a follow-up to thank you for being here. If you want to know more about this stuff, if you want to hear me and Jake Bernstein, my cybersecurity attorney co-host, talk about cyber risk management from a business perspective and not a ones and zeros perspective, then you could check out our podcast. It's called the Cyber Risk Management Podcast, and we publish an episode every other week. And, we're about to hit our 100th episode. And Jake and I were talking about that this morning, like, what are we going to do for our 100th episode? It's a big deal. I'm like, yeah, it is a big deal. I don't know. But we'll figure out something, and it's going to be fun. And we, like I said, we release every other week. So 100, that's like 200 weeks of doing this. And I survived hanging out with an attorney. So, I'm feeling pretty good about myself, right? Kind of holding my own. If you want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn. I welcome a connection request from you. And I'm not on Twitter that much, but if you're a Twitter person, go ahead and give me a tweet or send me a direct message, and I'll get an alert, and I will pop right over there and say, hey. So there you go.
Okay.
That's me, and I would love to talk with you.
And I think we went so long because both of us love talking about this stuff. So
yeah, poor Hella, she couldn't get a word in edgewise.
No, well, there's been a lot of very good information, and I think it will benefit everyone. And I just want to remind everybody too that we have been recording this session. So if you missed anything or you want to sort of refresh what you heard, you can go back and watch it again. And Kip, we want to thank you so much for joining us today, and it was a pleasure having you and letting us learning more about all the things we need to do, take care of our set up for taking care of having our cybersecurity.
You're welcome, Hella. I hope people do understand that it is the basis for a competitive advantage, and start thinking about it like that, as opposed to just some annoying cost of doing business. So thanks for having me.
And so thank you. We hope everyone will join us again. And for everyone, remember, check out Kip's podcast, especially now that it's the 100th episode coming up.
Definitely. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.